This project is supported in part by a grant from the Alaska Humanities Forum and the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. This project is also supported by a generous donation from Wells Fargo, a proud sponsor of Kenny Lake School. The Kenny Lake Bachelors Club is also a primary sponsor of Bonanza.
In the late 1800s, a sharecropper from the South named George Flowers was ready for an adventure. Flowers booked passage on a steamship in Seattle for Alaska, but he was denied admission because he was black. The heck with it, Flowers thought. I'll just walk. Walk a few thousand miles to Alaska. George Flowers would not be the first or last person connected with the story of Kennecott to encounter a setback, determine a course of action, and through steel will, move forward. High in the Wrangell Mountains, hidden by some of the most forbidding country in the world, a small mining camp thrived for more than 30 years. It would draw a wide collection of individuals, from ordinary men who went on to make millions, to everyday men and women searching for a piece of the American dream. From railroad men who battled the unruly Copper River and its canyon, to corporate barons who would use their incredible wealth from the Kennecott mine to build an international empire. Kennecott would impact the region's original native people and play a role in the economic and political history of Alaska. More than anything, it would serve as a testament to the power of human ingenuity and industry. The first people to recognize the importance of copper were the local native people known as the Ahtna. Using the process of annealing, or heating copper to 550 degrees Celsius, the Ahtna pounded this mineral into useful tools and decorations. They also used copper, which they found near present-day McCarthy, for arrows and spearheads and for trading with other native groups, especially the Eyak.
The Chugach Eskimos were one of the Ahtna's chief enemies. There are many stories of these natives traveling up the Copper River to battle natives during the time the Ahtna were hunting in the mountains. The Chugach would pillage Ahtna settlements all the way down the river. These intruders wanted copper bracelets, hunting equipment, and women.
In the early 1800s, the Russians began to explore a territory belonging to the Lower Ahtna, a group of Athabascans the Russians referred to as Menovsky, or Coppers. The Russians had established a trading post at Nuchek on Hitchinbrook Island in Prince William Sound, where the Ahtna traded furs, tanned moose hides, and native copper. Later, the Russians established a fort by Taral, near the junction of the Chitna and Copper Rivers. Here, the Ahtna traded furs for tobacco, beads, pots, pans, gunpowder, tea, and salt. Alexander Baranov, who later would become chief manager of the Russian-American Company, ordered A. Kuskov in 1797 to carry out a census of the Ahtna and to find out where and how the Ahtna mined copper.
In case of the rejection of this proposal, we shall no doubt consider them secret enemies of the Russian people, and everything they do not accept will in due time cause their repentance.
Kuskov was able to meet with a number of Ahtna chiefs. He reached the Chitna River, but he failed to locate the source of Ahtna copper. In response to reports that the British had established a trading post on the Middle Yukon River, the Russian-American Company's chief manager, Mikhail D. Tebenkov, instructed Ruf Serebrennikov in 1847 to ascend the Copper River to its headwaters, cross over to the Yukon River, and float it until he reached the coast.
I ask God to grant you health on the trip. In all else, I hope that next year the commander of the ship sent to Mikhailovsky Redoubt will bring you and your people back to Nova Archangelisk.
Later that summer, the Atna killed all the Russians when they were near the village of Batzelnetas.
One Atna said that the reason for the killing was that Serebrennikov insulted the chief of the Upper Atna. According to oral history provided by Katie Johns and Fred Johnser of Mentasta, the Russians took the village's chief, tied him to a stump, and whipped him. They also took the village's women and chased the men from their homes.
Despite attempts to explore the Copper River and find the source of Atna copper, the Russians decided against exploring the Chitna River, which would have taken them within striking distance of the Atna copper source.
The first Russians reached the mouth of the Chitna in 1796. Between 1819 and 1848, the Russians maintained a trading post at Copper Fort, which is pretty close to the mouth of the Chitna. For all that time, had very, very close relations with the Atna. Parties went up the main branch of the Copper River numerous times, explored the Tazlina drainage. Eventually, Serebrennikov got as far as Batzelnetas.
Word of a copper source somewhere deep in the Wrangell Mountains found its way to the Americans, who entered the territory after the United States purchased Alaska from the Russians in 1867. The first American to successfully explore the Copper River was Lieutenant Henry Allen. Henry Allen was described as tall, erect, handsome, and meticulous in his dress, with a pleasant manner and distinguished military bearing that made him a favorite with the ladies. In 1885, he ascended the Chitna River, eager to learn about the Atna's copper source. The Allen expedition mapped Wrangell Mountains and the Chitna River and the Chittistone River, now called the Nazina River, both those names incorporating the Athabascan word chitty, meaning copper. On April 15, 1885, Allen, his 3 white companions, and 3 natives reached Tyrol. There they found John Bremner, a prospector who had come up the season before, but was now in tough shape.
He certainly was the most uncouth specimen of manhood that I had ever, up till that time, seen. He had been living on rabbits which he snared, occasionally with a piece of dried salmon as a luxury. He was shortening his belt 1 hole every other day.
When Allen reached Tyrol, he decided to explore the Chitna River, unlike the Russian explorers who came before him.
I was unwilling to pass by an important tributary without learning something about it, and the supposed stores of minerals existing thereon.
The Allen party trekked up the Chitna River with not much more than blankets, rifles, and ammunition, and learned firsthand what it meant to live off the country.
Well, the Indians had left a few scraps laying around, and these, that neighbors nor their dogs would eat, we were forced by hunger to gather up and make a meal on. This is Lieutenant Allen's birthday, and he celebrated it by eating rotten moose meat.
4 days later, Allen and his men staggered into the main village of Chief Nikolai, where each member of the party consumed 5 pounds of moose meat. Nikolai's camp was located near the mouth of Dan Creek on the Nazina River. Here Allen saw copper knives and jewelry, all made by the Atna. Nikolai told Allen that he used copper nuggets found in a local river called Chittatu Creek. The Indians used this copper for utensils, musket balls, and for trading.
I do not believe that the native guard as a secret treasure the copper or other mineral beds, but think they would willingly reveal to the white man their knowledge in the matter.
The Allen expedition went on to journey to the headwaters of the Copper River, past the mouth of the Chistachina River, and overland to the headwaters of the Tanana River. The men descended the Yukon, explored the Koyukuk, and ended their expedition at St. Michael, a journey of some 1,500 miles in a single summer. Gold was discovered in the Klondike in 1896. While thousands of miners climbed across Chilkoot Pass and floated the Yukon River to reach Dawson, a few thousand miners streamed over Valdez Glacier in search of an all-American route to Dawson or another Klondike discovery in the Copper Basin. In 1896, a young Easterner startled his friends and family with the announcement that he planned to strike out for Alaska. Stephen Birch was the son of a wounded Civil War sergeant. In 1896, he was just 24 years old. Theodore Havemeyer, the vice president of American Sugar Refining Company, and his wife Lily took Stephen to heart and helped finance his education at a New York mining school. Havemeyer and his associates connected Birch with Captain W.R. Abercrombie's Copper River exploring expedition in 1898, which was ordered by President William McKinley to establish a route from Valdez to the Yukon River. Abercrombie wasn't exactly pleased to have the young, inexperienced Birch along on the expedition.
Maybe I can't fire you, but I can throw you out of my office.
In the spring of 1898, Captain W.R. Abercrombie was ordered to gather experienced scouts and lead them into the Copper River Valley. Though the expedition got a late start, they managed to cross the Valdez Glacier and reach the Clutina River. Lieutenant P.G. Lowe arrived in Copper Center on July 31st, where he gave his report of the situation.
More than half of the people who had come over the glacier had returned home disheartened, and I met no less than 200 returning prospectors between the glacier and Copper Center. The prospectors, not finding any gold, the disappointment was too much for them. This country was advertised before it was tested.
Most of the ones that came into the Copper Basin were Midwesterners. A lot of them were from farm backgrounds or had worked industrial jobs. They were not backwoodsman kind of people. They were from relatively settled parts of the country. And really the only big river that they'd ever seen was the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. They saw the Copper on the map, and it looked like a very substantial river, and I'm sure that they thought that the Copper River would be something like the Missouri, a river moving pretty slowly that they could pull up. By the time they got to Copper Center, which had been founded that summer, the summer of '98, most of them were done. They got boats, or they took the boats that they had, and they just floated down the Copper River and to Eyak and arranged for passage back to the lower 48.
Surviving the Copper River, surprise snowstorms, and dwindling supplies, the expedition made it all the way to Skagway on October 8th with the help of the Ahtna and a few Alaskan settlers. Stephen Birch, a child of the East who may never have been camping a single day in his life before coming to Alaska, had survived his first summer. In 1899, Abercrombie arrived back in Valdez. Here he met 10 prospectors led by Reuben McClellan, a rugged explorer from Minnesota. These prospectors had agreed to pool their interests so that a find by one would be shared by all. They hoped to locate the source of the copper bullets that had been shown to Lieutenant Henry Allen by Chief Nicolai in 1885. The McClellan group found the village of Toral in the springtime of 1899, a season known to the natives as the starving time. The Ahtna were hungry. Plants had not yet sprouted, animals were scarce after winter, and the salmon run was still a ways off. When the McClellan group offered to trade food, utensils, and firearms for the location to Nicolai's copper lode, the chief agreed. Some think Nicolai was swindled, but Nicolai achieved a better deal.
I think that Nicolai sold something that he had no use for something that he did have use for. I think it was value received. I'm sure that the prospectors thought that they had gotten the better of the deal and probably were telling everybody that they had put one over on Nicolai, but I don't think so.
The Nicolai claims were staked in July 1899 by Ed Gates, James McCarthy, and Arthur McNear. On inspection of the claims, McClellan found what he thought was a good deposit. While the deposit looked good on the surface, it didn't really go anywhere. It never produced any copper. Reuben McClellan returned to Valdez on April 17, 1900. He had one goal in mind: to develop the area that had become known as the Nikolai Lode. The year before, Oscar Rohn, a U.S. geologist, told the McClellan prospectors he had found copper float in the Kennecott River. During the summer of 1900, Clarence Warner and Tarantula Jack Smith moved upriver toward the glacier.
They looked across the gulch and observed a large green spot on the side of the mountain. Jack's companion declared it was a patch of grass. While discussing this, they became thirsty and Jack went down to the creek to get some water. While leaning over the bank, he saw a piece of float.
Not knowing whether it was silver or copper, he picked it up and brought it back to Warner. Warner agreed to follow the creek with Smith.
Gradually, as they came near the green patch in the mountains, the float became thicker, and presently they saw that instead of being a grass plot, it was an outcropping of copper ore. When he saw the size of it, Jack exclaimed, "My God, it's a bonanza."
After mapping their location, Smith and Warner met up with Reuben McClellan and the rest of the group. They then walked to Valdez, a distance of 200 miles. They promptly sought out investors, which sparked the interest of Stephen Birch.
Jack brought his find to my attention. "Mr. Birch," he said, "I've got a mountain of copper up there. There's so much of the stuff sticking out of the ground that it looks like a green sheep pasture in Ireland."
Backed by wealthy investors, Stephen Birch now set about to acquiring the claims. He was poised to make millions, and he set to work immediately.
Now is the time to make a barrel of money. After we get a hold of these claims, we can either sell them to the Lewisons or some other company, or make a deal to go in with them and form a big company.
When Dan Kane, one of the owners of the Bonanza claim, needed cash, Stephen Birch bought Kane's 1/11th interest in the mine for $2,500.
I want you to promise me not to use any information you have received through me unless you have my permission. Do this for me, and it will make my work easy with our party, and I assure you I will do my best to serve you.
Backed by the Havemeyers, Stephen Birch paid between $12,000 and $25,000 for each of the remaining 10 claims. The property came under the control of Alaska Copper and Coal Company, with Havemeyer as president. Stephen Birch became manager. In 1904, Stephen Birch sought financial support to construct a railroad that could reach the mines. He had already made a political ally in Alaska with James Wickersham, a territorial district judge located in Valdez, who had ruled in his company's favor when another group of miners claimed ownership of the Bonanza deposit. The two became friends. Even though Birch had a political ally, what he needed was someone to finance the construction of a railroad to the Bonanza and Jumbo mines. Using his contacts, he was able to draw support from the Morgan Bank and to meet with Dan Guggenheim, who was at the top of a mining empire.
Alaska is a new country. I should like to be one of those to bring it to its destined place in American affairs. It is not altogether a matter of money. There is some sentiment in an enormous undertaking of this sort. We want to go into the territory and build roads and smelters and mining towns and bring men there and populate the country where it is habitable and do for it what the earlier figures in the American railroad building did for sections of the Great West.
In June 1906, the Alaska Syndicate was formed. The Kennecott Copper Corporation would be responsible for building and operating the copper mine at Kennecott. The Copper River and Northwestern Railway would run from Kennecott to Cordova. The Alaska Steamship Company would transport the ore to a Guggenheim smelter in Tacoma, Washington. In addition, they purchased the Northwest Fisheries Company, which controlled 12 major salmon canneries. All of these companies were organized into what was called the Alaska Syndicate.
There's our friend Mr. Haney, who's probably as brainy as any in Skagway, I think, whose bright, pleasant smile shortens many a mile as he hands you his flask with a wink.
Big Mike Haney was a hardcore, cigar-smoking capitalist with vision and energy. People called him the Irish Prince, friends called him MJ. a man who enjoyed luxury even though white colors and black tuxedos meant little to him. He never married. Building railroads was his only passion. He had even run away from home at 14 to work on the Canadian Pacific Railroad.
Give me enough dynamite and snooze, I'll build a road to hell.
He rarely minced words or actions. One time, while working on the White Pass Railroad, one of Soapy Smith's gang members set up a drinking and gambling tent along the railroad right-of-way. Haney ordered one of his men to use dynamite to dislodge a rock above the man's tent. The man thought Haney was bluffing, and he almost learned too late that he wasn't. The tent owner barely escaped in his underwear. Haney made a fortune from the White Pass and Yukon Railroad, and he settled into a life of clover. He became a philanthropist, donating to hundreds of causes. But a life of luxury did little to quell his restless spirit. Then word came that a railroad was needed to reach the rich copper deposit in Kennecott. The same banker who helped finance the railroad from Skagway to the Yukon wanted Big Mike back on the job.
You did such an outstanding and profitable job for us on the White Pass that if you know of a better route than the others, you can count on us for financing.
Haney wasted no time. He scoured over maps of the Copper River region and decided that the best route would be up the Copper River through Abercrombie Canyon. He knew that the syndicate would be interested in constructing a railroad from Catala, 50 miles southeast of Cordova, which would give it access to the coal from the Bering River fields.
Hey, tell all the boys we're going to get busy, and that they are on the payroll as of today.
On January 6, 1906, Haney, using his own money, began to build his railroad in Cordova because it had a great harbor and had plenty of level ground to build tracks on. Cordova was a name given to the site by the Spanish explorer Don Calvador Fidalgo in 1790. Haney's first goal was to lay tracks to Abercrombie Landing. He had to cross miles of soggy tundra and the Copper River twice to get there. That was his first of many hardships. He had to contend with some of the worst weather he had ever seen in Alaska. There was permafrost, many glacier-fed streams, steep canyons, rock slides, and then in springtime there were, of course, the bugs.
Among the trials of the engineer are the fly pests. There's the little gnat who makes for your forehead, the little gray fly whose specialty is the ears and nose. A cure? There is none. Tobacco smoke does not seem to seriously bother Alaska's canary birds. In fact, I have many times watched a row of them perched on my pipe.
If anyone attempted to encroach on Haney's right-of-way through Abercrombie Canyon, he threatened to use dynamite as an invitation to reconsider. When some of Haney's men were threatening to go work in Seward on the Alaska Central Railway, Haney's friend, Dr. Whiting, rubbed croton oil on the skin of one of his patients that created a rash that looked like smallpox. He then quarantined the town. No ships would dock at Cordova because of the contrived smallpox epidemic, so the defecting men had nowhere to go but back to work for Haney.
Across the Rubicon, M.J. Haney, the railroad builder, has crossed the Copper River with his iron horses and is now laying track on the island. It is the marvel of the men familiar with railroad construction to note progress being made by Haney and his bunch of hustlers. If someone doesn't head him off down the coal field, he'll scare old Juno to death by running an engine into the place sometime in the near future.
Big Mike knew that he did not have the financial resources to finish the railroad, but he wanted to force the syndicate to buy out his right-of-way through Abercrombie Canyon. In October 1906, Michael Haney's gamble paid off. The syndicate purchased his Copper River Railroad. Stephen Birch announced that there would be a load of ore waiting by the time the railroad arrived in Kennecott. Birch began work on the mill while the railroad was being constructed. He and others devised a scheme for moving supplies to Kennecott. Since Abercrombie Rapids blocked access on the Copper River, the steamship Chintna was carried over Marshall Pass, upriver of Abercrombie Rapids, using pack horses and sleds. Its journey followed the Valdez Trail through Keystone Canyon and continued eastward over Marshall Pass. The steamship boiler itself weighed 5,700 pounds and could be moved only in winter across the frozen lakes and rivers. George Meals assisted in bringing the steamship and other supplies over the pass.
I worked freighting and packing from 1906 to 1910, mostly in Copper River and Slate Creek, so heavy stuff was in our line.
Before the steamships could relay supplies to Kennecott, the first buildings were built from available timber, 6-inch white spruce logs native to Alaska. When a transportation route was established, Sitka spruce and Douglas fir were brought up from Washington. During 1910, workers created a 150-foot-long crib dam from local timber. Located above the manager's house in a small gorge, it supplied drinking water and served to power a 250-horsepower hydroelectric plant, which was located north of the dam. The first building in Kennecott was the manager's office. It was built in 1906 and had a few additions. Another important structure was the tram terminus, built in 1908. It was the end of the tramway to the Bonanza Ridge mines. It rested on the top deck of the concentration mill. At 14 stories, this building was, and still is, the tallest and most impressive building in Kennecott. It climbs 150 feet up the hillside and was built on many terraces supported by timber cribbing. In 1907, while men at Kennecott battled the elements to bring a mine into production, in Valdez, a battle of a different sort was taking place. Talk shifted to the possibility of making Valdez the terminus of the railroad. The syndicate decided to start work again in Keystone Canyon. Along came an entrepreneur from Boston who owned a copper mine in Prince William Sound. Henry Durr Reynolds was a boomer and a true legend in his own mind. He envisioned Valdez as Alaska's San Francisco. Reynolds persuaded the citizens of Valdez to bankroll an electric railroad from Valdez to the top of Thompson Pass. Now there would be two companies attempting to build a railroad through Keystone Canyon. The syndicate hired a former deputy marshal, Edward Hazy, to guard syndicate rock work in Keystone Canyon and provided his men with rifles. In late August, things heated up. As George Hazlett was walking on the canyon grade, a foreman for the home railway confronted him.
You go in at your peril. We will defend this place like a man would defend his home.
Hazlett urged Hazy to stand up to the home railway men.
Take it cool, but I look to you boys to protect our rights. The right-of-way is ours until Congress declares otherwise, and we are wholly within our rights protecting it. Stay by the thing until I see you.
On September 25th, about 260 men carrying picks and shovels arrived near the entrance to Keystone Canyon and approached a barricade that Hazy had erected on the Copper River and Northwestern grade. Charles Ingersoll, an attorney from Kennecott, jumped up on a tree stump and fired up the workmen.
The only way to get any money or anything is to jump this cut and take possession of it.
Home railroad man Mark Morrissey led a group of workers carrying stones, shovels, clubs, and pick handles toward the barricade. Some of the home railway men were climbing above the barricade with dynamite. The men kept approaching the barricade. Hazy fired in the air, but they kept coming. Hazy shot at their feet and wounded 6. One later died from his wounds, and Hazlett and Hazy were indicted for murder. Hazy had to serve only 2 years in prison, but not before he had been struck on the head and was found floating in the Gastineau Channel near Juneau. A short time later, the railroad from Valdez would be abandoned, and Cordova would win out as the terminus of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway, sometimes called by pessimists the can't run and never will. Haney would be hired by the syndicate, insisting that his experienced crew stay on the job.
The work of pushing the Copper River Railroad through to the Bonanza mines is assured. The question of money has been solved, for the Morgan and Guggenheim interests have pledged all the money, $12 million, that is necessary to put the line through.
When completed, the railroad stretched 196 miles from Cordova to Kennecott. Railroad crews, numbering 6,000 at one time, battled against an unruly canyon and harsh weather. In the winter, horse and dog teams were used to transport supplies along the rail line, and in the summer, steamboats were used. The temperamental Copper River had to be bridged 3 times. In 1910, Terral had been abandoned and Chitina became a hub of activity. There were plans to extend the railroad from Chitina to the Tanana Valley, to the Yukon, perhaps even to Fairbanks. One of the railroad tunnels built outside Chitina became notorious. A number of people were killed in the tunnel during construction, and every time a train went through the tunnel, part of the top would collapse. Later, O.A. Nelson was hired to take the roof off of the tunnel. 8 miles of bridges were created along the route. Bridges such as the Miles Glacier Bridge or the $1 Million Bridge that required 5 million pounds of steel pitted man against the forces of nature. The Cuscalana Bridge, called one of the impossible bridges, was built during the dead of winter in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero in only 2 months. The workers were so bundled up in warm clothing they were described as woolly bears on a bridge. There was also the Gillahina Trestle. It took only 8 days to complete, and trains were able to cross it on January 28, 1911.
Call it what you will, the work is nothing short of marvelous. When weather conditions are taken into consideration, for the past 2 weeks, the thermometer has been ranging from between 30 to 60 below, and at times during this extremely cold hours, trouble was experienced by the carpenters in driving the bolts, which split the heavy timbers like a cake of ice.
The railroad arrived in Kennecott in 1911. During 5 years of construction, the crews battled floods, heavy snows, and fierce winds while chiseling their way into the rock faces of 2 canyons. They laid track on glacial moraine and across one glacier. The construction of the Copper River Railroad was an act of sheer steel will, a battle of technology and ingenuity against the powerful forces of nature. M.J. Haney didn't get to see the finish. He died in 1909, 2 years before the railroad was completed. The last copper spike was hammered in Kennecott, March 29, 1911. True to his word, Stephen Birch had a load of ore valued at $250,000 waiting for the first train. The Kennecott operation depended on the mill building for concentrating, bagging, and shipping the copper ore. The ore came down on a tramway in small tram buckets from the mines. The 5 major mines in the mountains were the Bonanza, Jumbo, Motherlode, Glacier, and Erie mines. The mines in the high mountains were connected with underground tunnels. Although there were bunkhouses outside of the mines, miners often ate their meals in underground dining rooms. There was electric lights in parts of the tunnels, as well as constant ventilation. The mine walls were broken down with compressed air-powered jackhammers and explosives. The ore was then shoveled into ore cars on a track and pushed out to the tramway where it was stored in large wooden bins. The tramway buckets were loaded from the bins and sent down to the mill. The Kennecott aerial tramway was like a giant ski lift for ore buckets. Since the copper mines were located so high up in the mountains, there needed to be a way to bring it down to the mill as efficiently as possible. The tramway was the best solution. The tram buckets, each carrying as much as 1/3 of a ton of ore, were carried down to the mill building on 1 1/4 inch thick steel cable. The 3 tramways had a total of 55 towers, breakovers, and stations to support the cable. The Glacier Tramway had 6 structures and was 3/4 of a mile long. The Bonanza had 21 structures along its 2-mile long line. and the jumbo tramway had 22 structures and was 2.5 miles long. Catch and release mechanisms on the tram buckets aided miners in handling the buckets. When the bucket hit the bottom of the tramway, a pin or catch would release the bucket from the cable, and a worker could then dump it into the crusher. First, the ore was sorted by size and grade. The smaller quantity of high-grade ore was sent straight through the mill to be bagged and shipped. The larger quantity of lower-grade ore was sent to the crushers. The crushers used in the Kennecott mill building were large machines that spun two steel rollers in opposite directions to each other. The ore was forced between the two rollers and crushed under their power. After crushing, the ore was sent to another set of screens to be sorted further. The oversized ore was sent to be crushed again. The ore that fell through the screens was sent down to sets of jigs and tables. Because the cost to ship their copper ore out of Alaska was so high, the Kennecott Copper Company had to maximize efficiency in order to make a profit. This is why they took the effort to squeeze every last ounce of copper mineralization from the ore they mined. Only about 12% of the raw tonnage pulled from the mines could be smelted to make copper. After the rock had been crushed and sorted several times, it was mixed with water and poured onto a vibrating table. The motion of the table would move the water and rock mixture over the table. The pure copper ore, being heavier than most of the other types of rocks in the combination, would not be able to bounce over little ledges on the table and would collect at one end.
White's waste. The dark stuff is good ore, and the middle stuff is called middlings. We send the waste to flotation, which is another process we haven't talked about yet. We send the ore out. We're not going to mess with it again. We're going to sack it. And the stuff in the middle becomes the feed for the tables to the next level down.
At the flotation unit, the finely ground copper ore was put in a tank with oil and water. The copper minerals were attracted to bubbles created in the bottom of the tank. The bubbles drew the copper minerals to the surface, which formed a frothy residue that could be collected, dried, and shipped. The leaching plant began regular operation in 1916. Ore that could not be treated on the tables was placed in large tanks, and ammonia was allowed to flow through the material. The copper was dissolved and removed from the tanks as a liquid, which was heated until the ammonia evaporated, leaving a copper concentrate behind. Combined, the leaching and flotation processes helped the Kennecott mine reach an astounding 98% efficiency some years. As much as the Alaska Syndicate hated to admit it, America and Alaska were changing in the early 1900s. Industrial and financial magnates such as John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Daniel Guggenheim, who once were hailed as industrial heroes that helped raise the American standard of living, were now starting to be viewed with distrust. Inspired by a popular trust-busting president, Theodore Roosevelt, Americans became weary of unbridled capitalism that had created the trusts, or large corporations that wielded incredible political power in America. Encouraged by a muckraking press that sought to expose and sometimes manufacture corruption in high places, and aggravated by the Keystone Canyon shootout that some argued was orchestrated by the Googies, progressives attacked the syndicate. It acquired a reputation as an economic Goliath in Alaska with its control of copper and gold mines, fish canneries, and steamship travel. Some insisted that the syndicate wanted to strip the territory of its resources while leaving nothing behind for the people who lived there. James Wickersham, who at one time had been a supporter of the syndicate, now accused it of wanting to use Alaska as its own plaything. Perhaps this distrust stemmed from a snub by the syndicate when it turned him down for a job as an attorney. Wickersham, for his part, fanned anti-syndicate sentiments to win election as a non-voting delegate to Congress beginning in 1908.
If ever there was a criminal conspiracy in the United States to get the immense resources that belong to the people, it is that of the Alaska Syndicate in Alaska.
Not everyone believed Wickersham's motives were purely altruistic.
James Wickersham is a political sorehead. Any man he can't use, he wants to put in the gutter and walk on him. That Alaska delegate thinks of the Guggenheims and the Morgans are the worst people in the world. But he didn't think so until he applied to Stephen Birch, one of the heaviest stockholders of the Bonanza mine, for the support of those interests and their endorsements of his campaign, and it was refused him. Since that time, the Guggenheims are fiends incarnate and must be driven from the earth, according to Wickersham.
Wickersham would serve 6 terms as delegate until 1920, and he was re-elected in 1930. He helped Alaska gain home rule and territorial status as part of the 1912 Organic Act. Wickersham would be the first to introduce a statehood bill in 1916. Even though the Alaska Syndicate disbanded in 1915 and many of its assets were purchased by the Kennecott Copper, of which Stephen Birch served as president, the syndicate was still viewed as an economic bully throughout the territory. Wickersham argued the syndicate wanted to create a monopoly on transportation in Alaska and convinced President Woodrow Wilson to support a federal railroad in Alaska in 1912. When the railroad bill reached the House floor in January 1914, Wickersham delivered a 5.5-hour speech during which he argued that the railroad would help Alaska achieve freedom from the grips of Guggenheim control. The bill passed, and the government established its operations headquarters at Ship Creek Landing, the future Anchorage. In 1915, it began work on the Alaska Railroad that would stretch from Seward to Fairbanks. For the children, and most of the workers in Kennecott, the war between the political and economic powerhouses in the United States seemed a million miles away.
Rules to keep your nose clean and stuff like that. Do it, care for your stuff, everybody helped everybody else, and it was a good deal all around.
Oh, the freedom, I guess. Folk never seemed to worry about where we were or what we were doing.
Most of the children growing up in Kennecott had very fond memories of the mill town. This place they grew up in stuck in their mind for many years. It was a special place. Inger Ricky's father came to Kennecott in 1907. He was a master carpenter who built many of the buildings and homes in Kennecott. Inger was born on November 11, 1918. To her, Kennecott was a very special place to grow up.
I thought it was the most wonderful childhood anybody could have had because you had so much freedom. They just let us roam around the town by them. There was what they call the yard gang, the people that shoveled snow and did all of the work around town, and they seemed to take care of us. I mean, if anything happened, they would have been right there because they knew all of us. You know, it was real fun.
The red buildings of Kennecott loomed over the hillsides, stood like thrones overlooking the glaciers, and stretched into the sky. There was freedom in this town, but the children still had to go to school. From 1911 to 1913, the schoolhouse resided in the community of Blackburn, which was just north of McCarthy. Then, in 1913, Blackburn went downhill, soon becoming a ghost town. They placed the schoolhouse on a train and moved it up to Kennecott. The school had one room, which taught children from grades kindergarten to 8th. There were about 8 to 10 kids in the school, taught by one teacher. Teachers of the school had to be single women. The women usually married one of the many mine workers during the first year of teaching. In later years, the school began night classes for the miners, who were mostly foreigners. They wanted to learn English and they wanted to become American citizens. Because of these night classes and the increase in students, Kennecott needed a larger school, so they built a 2-room schoolhouse in the 1920s. There were 20 to 24 kids at that time. When the teacher dismissed the children from school, the kids made their way back home to one of the many cabins lining the hillsides. They were simple little red cabins with a kitchen, a back door, windows, and about 4 rooms. The rooms were filled with homemade furniture and items ordered from the Sears catalog. There were at least 20 to 24 families living in Kennecott. Their front yards were the railroad tracks, but the whole of Kennecott was their backyard.
Morrises lived right next door. We were a fearsome foursome. I used to sneak out of my bedroom window because my bedroom window faced their house. And I snuck out of my window and we'd go up to the tennis court. I don't know how we all lived through the things we did.
Skiing and skating and hiking and picnicking and just anything that was outdoors. And of course we went sliding in the winter with our sleds. We did that a lot.
We went out to play. We wore pants. We wore maybe a couple pairs of pants, sweaters and coats, and everything we could get our hands on.
Wives of the managers, staff, and skilled workers stayed home and made their cabins as cozy as possible. They shopped at the store, cooked, and supported their family. The wives ordered clothes from catalogs or made them with needle and thread.
I wore blouses and skirts. I had felt shoes and warm underwear, which I hated because it made my ankles look lumpy.
The recreation or rec hall was the center of social life and entertainment for the Milltown. There were lines on the floor for basketball and brackets over the lights. It was used as a gym and a theater. A movie screen was pulled down every Wednesday and Sunday night. Children paid 10 cents and adults paid 35 cents. Sometimes the rec hall served as a dance floor.
Oh, I imagine. There were a lot of men. Of course, there were just a few families, and all these single guys. And heck, I was, 9, 10, 11 years old? And I danced with all these fellas.
Want to dance?
Then, on Christmas Eve, the rec hall glistened with a lit-up tree and a fireplace with stockings hanging on the mantel. Red and green decorations were everywhere. It was the Christmas Eve children's program.
Well, the stage was only put up at Christmas time for the school children's program, and every child in the school had a part in it. And I was shy, and it scared me to death. I always had a part in a play, and they always had me sing. I would look out at my father. He always had a twinkle in his eye.
Not everyone who visited the rec hall sought to spread goodwill. In 1921, the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, made an unusual appearance at Kennecott. Kennecott didn't have any black employees at the time, but they did employ many immigrants. It's not really understood what the KKK was hoping to accomplish with its minstrel show.
The majority of the workers at Kennecott, not management or skilled workers, but the miners and the mill workers at Kennecott were of immigrant stock or were Catholic or both. And Catholics were also, the second Ku Klux Klan was pretty heavily against Catholics.
There was a handball court outside, but the main attraction was the tennis courts. They even played tennis in the winter. People pulled out their shovels and scraped off the court. When the mosquitoes came out, they covered the courts with nets.
My parents play tennis. A lot of times in the evening, they go out and play tennis because it stayed light for so long.
They also had a baseball diamond, which was flooded in the winter to make a hockey rink. Ice skating and hockey were the chief recreations. All around the ice rink were lights which lit up the blue ice like a stage. It was an exquisite sight.
Mother had a beautiful pair of skates, and they looked so nice, and my dad made them out of a round saw blade and attached them to her boots. She was very proud of them.
When it was summer and fall, the hockey rink became a baseball diamond. On the 4th of July, this baseball diamond was put to great use. The miners received only 2 days off a year, Christmas and the 4th of July. On the 4th, families wandered down to McCarthy for races and the baseball game between Kennecott and McCarthy. The game was so competitive, McCarthy imported a pitcher for their team from the lower 48. It was a day full of ice cream and laughter. There were simple pastimes in Kennecott as well. A dairy barn housed milking cows, so the people of Kennecott always had fresh milk, cheese, and cream. Some people raised chickens. There were a couple of vegetable gardens. Some people went hunting. They went on glacier hikes and picked berries. Some went camping at Long Lake. If the husbands were busy, the wives hitched up their skirts and went to Long Lake with their children and explored more of Alaska's wonders. George Flowers was waiting for the children at Long Lake. He made a living by fishing, trapping, and as a track walker for the railroad. He loved the children, and the children loved him back. When Kennecott closed, the kids continued to write to their beloved friend living at Long Lake, George Flowers.
When we went to Long Lake, we lived in a little cabin and fished in the creek. George Flowers cooked fish like no one else. He put it all in the frying pan and cooked it, and then turned it all over like it was one big fish cake. It was marvelous. You could eat the whole thing.
We stopped by a lake. It was a lovely day, and everybody dons their bathing suits and jumps in. We get out. We have these leeches all over us. Horrible things. That was the end of that for me. I would never swim in one of those lakes again.
Not everyone celebrated their time at Kennecott. On June 24, 1916, Stephen Birch married Mary Rand, daughter of the Minneapolis Gas Light Company president. They traveled north on the steamship Mariposa, remodeled to create a suite that would meet Mrs. Birch's requirements. The private railway car Kennecott met them at the dock. Birch had a magnificent cottage built for his wife in Kennecott. It overlooked the rest of the mining town, high up on the mountainside. The inside of the house was fancier than anything else in Kennecott. There was a beautiful mantel around the fireplace. The trim was made of peacock ore, a beautiful blue and purple copper ore that was very rare. The peacock ore was polished and shining, surrounding the fireplace. Mary Birch grew disenchanted with Alaska. The couple quickly returned to New York. Mrs. Birch never returned to Kennecott. After their Alaska honeymoon, Stephen Birch did not return to Kennecott for 15 years. November 14th, 1932, from O.K. Whipple of Kennecott.
Regret to inform you that your son Henry was overcome by carbon monoxide gas while working in small building containing pump and electric plants. Extreme cold had caused him to close door. Found unconscious. Dr. Wilson summoned. Failed to respond to inhalator treatment. Deepest sympathies.
Kennecott sent this telegram, collect.
When I first started the job, I was so tired I couldn't even stay awake after my first shift to eat dinner.
Calling Kennecott a town is really a misnomer. Kennecott was really just a camp, and it was designed to produce ore.
While the Kennecott kids saw living at the mine as an adventure, for the typical miner it was all work. Miners often worked 10-hour days and received only 2 days off a year. A common laborer in 1923 made $4.25 a day. Miners made $5.25 a day. Skilled men, $5.50 a day. Electricians and mechanics were paid between $5.50 and $5.75 a day. Room and board cost $1.45, and each employee had a further deduction of 8 cents a day for hospital dues. At its peak, Kennecott employed nearly 600 workers. George Sullivan, who later became mayor of Anchorage, was a hungry 15-year-old in Valdez in the late 1920s. His brother-in-law worked as a timekeeper in Kennecott. He told young George, whose father had died just a year before, that he might be able to get him a job at the mine. George needed work even though he was 3 years too young to be hired at the mine.
No, I put on the form, I was 15, and they said to me, you know, you're supposed to be 18 to work here. And I said, well, yeah, but I came a long ways and I sure need a job. And they said, well, we'll put him up on the tram, he probably won't last 2 weeks anyway. And I was so broke I lasted all summer.
George learned early that Kennecott was no summer camp. After 3 weeks of work, he was so tired he just couldn't wake up one morning.
I fell sound asleep and didn't wake up in time to go to work. And one of the shift foremen came down, beat on my door and said, what are you doing, quitting? And of course I was scared to death, 15 years old, you know. No, I'm not quitting. And I ran up there and they bawled me out for it, but that was the only time I ever slept in.
Worker injuries were common. Ernest Vanderveerd was thrown from a moving bucket and fell 40 feet to jagged rocks. Daniel Reeder was injured in a railroad tunnel cave-in 1914. George Sullivan almost met his doom in the mill ore crusher.
What it was one of those wet days, and you know, the ore was wet, the floor was wet that we worked on and stuff, and I'd tipped the ore bucket and going to reach for the mallet, and I slipped. I stumbled, and I fell down the crusher, and at the last second grabbed the top of the thing. You know, it's just horrible to get back up, and this shift foreman was in the shack, and of course he didn't hear me. I was screaming my head off, and I finally scrambled back up. I don't know yet today how I did it, but I did. Of course, he came out about that time, and because the buckets were all piling up, you know, they don't stop running. So there's about 30 buckets all piled up, and he pulled a stop on the thing. Instead of being sympathetic, he was mad at me for for having fallen in there, but it'd have been a nice mess if I'd gone on through.
If you were injured, your pay stopped until you returned to work.
But you know, some of these settlements that you read about, they talk about, the tram, something went wrong with the bucket line, and the man fell 40 feet and permanently was disabled. And the company said it was, it wasn't their fault, and he said there was something wrong with your equipment. And it's sort of like, depending on who they get to testify on each side, and he gets a minimal payment, a couple $100 or something instead of the $20,000 he was asking or whatever. Well, even the tram, it's like you signed a contract to work here. I mean, it's a dangerous place. In some ways, I think that era of American history, it's like hard work was expected and being injured was expected. There's a reason why life expectancy didn't hit 50 years old for a long time.
Despite the hard conditions, many people who worked at Kennecott were grateful to have jobs, especially during the lean years of the Great Depression.
To R.E. Sullivan, Kennecott. Am in Anchorage and nearly broke. Can I come up and go to work? Answer by wire. Collect. At once.
Kennecott attracted workers from more than 40 countries, for whom the mine served as a gateway to the American dream.
The food was good. The place where we lived was good. It was clean. They kept it clean, kept it rooms up. The conditions up at the tram were good. That you just had certain things you were supposed to do. Up at the mine itself, the miners, for the most part, were very happy to work up there. They say they made good money. They had good meals, good food, good room, and everything, and they enjoyed it. Most of them, they'd work, some of them 10, 12 months without ever coming out of the mine. And some of them would go on outside, and some of them would go to McCarthy and party, as I say, and blow their money, and 3 weeks later they were back up at the mine again.
Many of the workers here were from other countries, a lot with Scandinavia, Norway, Finland, and sort of that type of thing. And they wanted to learn English, and they wanted to become American citizens. So they had English classes and citizenship classes. There was Japanese who were cooks and laundries. There was reference to some Japanese who were here. A good chunk of them were immigrants, yes. Kennecott also had offices in Seattle, so they were actively recruiting in Seattle, trying to send people up.
We have to do something, and the only way out of it, as far as I can see, is to go to Alaska. If possible, we would try to get work as surveyors but foreigners as we are and the bad times taken into consideration, I imagine it would be rather hard to get something without recommendations.
Riding the ore buckets could be dangerous. Miners would have to sign a release form if they wanted to ride in the buckets, and most did without hesitation. Not only did the ore buckets provide a prime view of the spectacular Wrangell Mountains, but it offered the riders a sporting opportunity.
And so a lot of the miners, they'd take the coming down, they'd take the ore. A lot of rabbits down there, and they'd try to hit the rabbits with the ore. And then the fellas on the other end were mad because they're throwing all the ore out, it's supposed to go down to the crusher.
When workers were injured or sick, they went to the hospital in Kennecott, which had the first X-ray in Alaska. The hospital building, along with the staff house and manager's house, stood out from all the other buildings because they were painted white.
I was on stilts. My dad had made us some stilts, and I fell and knocked my knee out of joint. That was one thing in the hospital. And then when I was 10, I got pneumonia. So I was in the hospital about almost a month, I think. I found the papers on that in the hospital. Really? Yeah. And another thing I found the papers on was when I was born, and I couldn't believe that they were still there. I still have them.
The nurses were like the school teachers. They had to be single. If they married, they were fired, and another nurse was employed. The only way a married nurse could continue working was to marry the doctor. During World War I, when copper prices plummeted, Kennecott experienced its first and only strike. 200 unorganized miners walked out while the manager was in Seattle. A 35-man detachment from the 14th Infantry guarded the bridges along the railroad. The workers wanted a flat rate of $5.75 a day and improved living conditions. Kennecott did not budge. The corporation brought in 200 strikebreakers. After 45 days, the corporation agreed to a wage increase, a new bunkhouse, mess hall, and even a recreation hall. However, they refused to rehire the union agitators, and afterward, each worker had to sign a pledge that he was not a member of a union. When all is said and done, working in Kennecott was a hard way to make a living. Sullivan isn't so sure he would do it all over again.
Well, I suppose if I was 15 and broke and hungry, I would. It's funny, different things I've done in my life that now are somewhat historical. At the time was just looking for a job.
Even in death, the poorer workers found it hard to get ahead. Most of these men could not afford burial outside and were laid to rest in a cemetery about a half-mile out of town. Those who could afford it were transported out of Kennecott to be buried elsewhere. The manager of the Kennecott's laundry, Kei Sakagami, died in Kennecott in June 1936. He was buried in the camp cemetery. When the people at Kennecott learned of World War I, Stephen Birch was out on a hunting trip, so a messenger was sent to tell him the news. Upon hearing the news, Birch sat still near a fire, sipping his coffee. Someone finally asked him what he was going to do about it, and he told them that he was going to finish out his hunting trip, then go back to New York, take advantage of the war, and make millions. Stephen Birch was right to think that he would make a lot of money off the war. Prices hit a high, and Kennecott started to increase copper production. The United States needed plenty of copper to make electric wire and brass shells. Kennecott's highest producing year was 1916, when they produced about $28 million worth of copper ore. The corporation expanded the buildings, mill, and some of the mines. In 1916, the Copper River and Northwestern Railway hauled about 100 million pounds of ore. Copper prices fluctuated from 14 cents a pound during the mine's early years to 21 cents a pound by 1919, and then it dropped to 10 cents a pound in the 1920s. Prices reached 5 cents a pound in 1932, so the mines shut down temporarily until 1935, when the price of copper was set at 9 cents a pound. In 1933, Kennecott only produced about 27,840 pounds of copper, valued at $1,824. During the Great Depression, low prices stuck and forced Kennecott's closing. Copper prices dropped from 24 cents to 5 cents between 1929 and 1931. In 1932, the bridge over the Copper River was destroyed by floods, which brought a halt to railroad traffic. Since there were no trains going to Kennecott to pick up the mined copper, or train cars leaving Kennecott full of copper ore, the mining operation had to be shut down until it could be repaired. The mine reopened in 1935 and permanently closed on November 11, 1938, after years of low prices. Nell McCann came to Kennecott in January 1929 in hopes of acquiring a husband. Considered an old maid at the age of 25, McCann went to Kennecott's Seattle Employment Office seeking a job that would send her to Kennecott and, hopefully, her future husband. She was hired as a secretary for the Kennecott mine soon after applying, and she traveled to Kennecott by steamship. She lived in Kennecott for several years before marrying a plumber she had met there. She gave birth to a daughter named Sharon in 1938. She was the last child born at the Kennecott Hospital. In October, 8 months later, the whole McCann family was on the last train out of Kennecott. The last tram bucket brought ore from the Jumbo mine to the mill on October 23, 1938. And the last train passed through Chitna en route to Cordova on November 11th. A World War I veteran named Billy Williams wrote the following poem to commemorate this occasion.
For 30 years the iron horse crept over the winding rail to carry the copper from Kennecott and haul the sourdough mail. The hand of time and the work of men who came in numerous bands, with sweat and toil from earth have wrought the wealth of these great lands. It matters not the end has come to Rex Beach's iron trail, for men with grim tenacity will live on and still prevail. To dig from Mother Earth the wealth that still lies hidden there, and on their back as years before, the burden they will bear.
Many in Kennecott thought the shutdown would be temporary. Some people closed their houses as if for the winter. Other folks left their fine china on the shelves. When Kennecott closed, most of its employees left the area. The corporate owners took their earnings and spent them elsewhere. Yet still, Kennecott has left a legacy we can still see in Alaska today.
This is just a lot of people who either used the money that they earned at Kennecott to develop other property or were inspired by what Kennecott did. Virtually all of the copper exploration work that went on into the 50s, even into the 60s in the Wrangels, was based on the inspiration of Kennecott. They were all looking for another Kennecott.
It was during the 1930s that miners in the Wrangels made a strike of dubious value. A 5,445-pound pure copper nugget was found on Dan Creek, under 40 feet of overburden. It is now on display at the University of Alaska Museum in Fairbanks. James McCarthy and his fellow group of prospectors came across this find on Nugget Creek. It was eventually moved to Strelna, where it sat outside Dwyer's Roadhouse. Later it was sold to Al Swalling, who kept it in his Anchorage basement. Cordova was established as the terminus for the railroad. Just 1 year after its founding, Cordova could boast of 10 stores, 2 hotels, 2 lumber yards, 3 churches, 10 saloons, and a school, plus 1,500 people. Anyone and anything that had to go to Kennecott was going through Cordova.
5 grocery stores, 5 general merchandise stores, 2 hotels, 2 hardware stores, 4 barber shops, 1 photograph gallery, 1 electric fixture store, 2 bakeries, 2 transfer barns, 1 sawmill, 6 apartment houses, 1 bowling alley, 5 cigar stands, and 10 saloons.
Chitina was also established as a railroad siding in 1910. Boosters hoped that the railroad would eventually go into the Tanana Valley and perhaps to the Yukon River. Chitina started out as a junction for the railroad. Some of the big names in Chitina included Owen Nelson. He was a practical joker who liked to paint ghosts on buildings in the town. Later, a bush pilot, Mudhole Smith, gained title to the entire town of Chitina. Strelna, too, was established as a railroad siding. There used to even be streetlights in Strelna, along with Dwyer's Roadhouse, which burned in 1925. Tourists would stay at the roadhouse and explore the Tuscaloosa River. Strelna was also the place where Chief Nikolai's youngest brother, Escalita, spent his time at subsistence sites. Escalita died near Strelna during the influenza epidemic of 1918. Kennecott also gave McCarthy its start. John Barrett owned the land that Kennecott used as a railroad turnaround. Barrett started to sell plots of land to the squatters, and that was the beginning of McCarthy. McCarthy was also where many of the prospectors and some of the workers at Kennecott would go wild on their days off. The age of Kennecott helped usher in the region's first tourists. Kennecott also played an important role in the development of Alaska. Alaska's 2 most powerful statehood advocates, Senator Bob Bartlett and Senator Ernest Gruening, both used the history of Kennecott to advocate statehood. Bartlett, an Alaskan delegate to Congress, delivered a speech to the 1955 Constitutional Convention delegates, calling for a strong state government to counterbalance the economic muscle of powerful outside interests.
The Kennecott copper operation was typical of a 19th century robber baron philosophy, which still has its few advocates today. Copper in the value of over $200 million was removed from the Chitina district. Their area was high-graded, with ores of lesser value disregarded. The operation was shut down in 1938. The tremendous production and investment left absolutely nothing of enduring value for the territory and its citizens, except a small ghost town which has become a minor tourist attraction.
Ernest Gruening complained that Alaska was not receiving enough revenues from its resources. He fought hard for change.
The wealth of Alaska was being drained off, and next to nothing was staying there for its needs.
Gruening attacked Kennecott as having enriched many individuals who never saw Alaska and had no thought of ever coming here or doing anything for the territory.
If there has been one important ingredient missing in our 88 years as a district, as a territory, it is that little preposition by. Many things have been done for us, even more things have been done to us, but very little have we been permitted to do by us.
With the money that the Morgan Guggenheims made from the Kennecott mine, they developed North America's largest open pit mine in Utah. They also established another mine in Chile. On November 11, 1938, the Alaska Kennecott mine permanently closed. Between 1911 and 1938, approximately 70 miles of underground tunnels helped produce 591,535 tons of copper and 9 million ounces of silver. An era of copper mining ended in the Wrangels, leaving barn-red buildings, empty houses, people's discarded belongings, and pieces of machinery in the midst. Flyers, newspapers, and radio stations all announced the closure of the mine. In the early 1960s, Consolidated Wrangell Mining entered the scene. They rebuilt the roads all the way up to the mine sites and drove down Suburbans full of copper ore to the new airstrip that was built down in McCarthy. In the early 1970s, they reorganized themselves into the Great Kennecott Land Company, subdivided lots, and auctioned them off. In 1998, the U.S. National Park Service purchased many of the significant buildings and land of Kennecott for $3.2 million from the Great Kennecott Land Company, and the Kennecott Copper Corporation donated the subsurface estate. Buildings such as the mill, power plant, and machine shop are now being stabilized. Buildings such as the store and post office are being restored. The schoolhouse, the recreation hall, and many other buildings have been repaired, and many more will be restored in the years to come. The hospital and the annex bunkhouse are just a few of the buildings that are beyond repair and are going to be left to fall apart. More than 9,000 people visit Kennecott per year. Just as the buildings at Kennecott would fade, so would the characters who played a role in the mine's development. Chief Nikolai died around 1900. He assisted several early exploring parties, including the Allen expedition in 1885. Local prospectors named several important local features in his honor, including Nikolai Creek and Nikolai Butte. Henry Allen went on to receive his General Star during the Spanish-American War and served as the first chief of the Philippine Constabulary following the Philippine insurrection. Following World War I, he headed the American occupation forces in Germany. He was promoted to Major General in 1920, the rank he held when he retired in April 1923. He died in 1930. Stephen Birch, the man who purchased options from the McClellan Party and negotiated the deal with the Morgan Guggenheim interest to develop the Kennecott mine, died in December 1940. He was buried in Harsdale, New York.
Stephen Birch died fairly young, and Mary lived on for another 20 or 30 years. They have very generously donated money from the Stephen and Mary Birch Foundation Trust to the Park Service in order to do interpretive work at Kennecott. So the family, the Stephen Birch family, is still involved in one way or another.
James Wickersham went on to practice law in Juneau, Alaska after 1932. He was an editor of Alaska Territorial Law Reports and of Old Yukon and Alaskan literature. He died in Juneau, Alaska in 1939. His remains were cremated and deposited in the Old Tacoma Cemetery in Tacoma, Washington. George Flowers lived at Long Lake in the 1920s and 1930s. He eventually froze his feet while trapping, contracted gangrene, and died in Valdez. Because he was an African American, he was buried in the native cemetery, and his grave was destroyed by the tsunami generated by the 1964 earthquake. Michael Haney died 1 week before his 46th birthday of pulmonary tuberculosis brought on by a shipwreck he barely survived. He became immortalized in Rex Beach's The Iron Trail. He left his $1 million fortune to Catholic charities and to an Episcopal bishop to benefit Alaskan Indians. Nearly 1,000 friends and associates attended his funeral. Henry Durr Reynolds, the flamboyant boomer who first promoted the home railway scheme, was arrested in 1928 for vagrancy in New York after he wandered away from the psych ward of Philadelphia General Hospital. Now, if you walk along the streets of Kennecott, you will see that nature has the final word. As the last unprotected buildings and the final remnants of the railway give way to the relentless assault of time. But if you listen carefully, perhaps you too can still hear the distant echoes of the bold men and women who journeyed into this region, driven by a sense of hope and a desire to challenge the unknown. Regardless of their successes or failures, most possessed a spirit of adventure that drove them from all that was predictable into a wilderness that forced them to reinvent who they were. As we rediscover their stories, perhaps we too feel something of their restless spirit rekindled within ourselves, their stories revealing to us something about who we are today. Perhaps their echoes may not be so distant after all.